Late in the evening, the town was quiet in that familiar way where even the sound of a car feels louder than usual. The Army lieutenant colonel had just finished a long day at the base. His shoulders ached from the weight of meetings, reports, and responsibilities that never seemed to end. All he wanted was to reach home, change out of his uniform, and sit down with a warm cup of tea. The road ahead was almost empty, lined with dim streetlights that flickered as if fighting sleep as he drove. He kept his window slightly open, letting in the cool night air. It felt refreshing after hours in indoor spaces. He adjusted the radio to a soft station, something calm to ease his mind. He had driven this route countless times, so nothing about the road surprised him. But tonight, something different happened. A pair of flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought they were meant for someone else. It was a quiet street, and he hadn't noticed anything unusual. But when the patrol car stayed close and the siren gave a short burst, he realized he was the one being signaled to pull over. He slowed down, eased the car to the side, and parked under a streetlight. He took a deep breath, calming his nerves. Traffic stops were something he had seen many times, but rarely from this side of the window. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, a habit drilled into him from safety briefings. The police vehicle stopped a short distance behind him. The lieutenant colonel looked into the mirror and saw two officers inside. One of them opened the door and stepped out, walking toward him with steady steps. The officer's flashlight moved across the back of the car, then along the side, and finally toward the window. The lieutenant colonel lowered his window fully, keeping his hands still on the wheel. The officer didn't speak immediately. He kept shining the light, checking the interior and the driver. The silence felt heavy, but the lieutenant colonel stayed calm. After a moment, the officer finally asked for his license and registration. The voice carried a firm tone, neither friendly nor hostile, just sharp and direct. The lieutenant colonel nodded, moving slowly so there was no confusion. "May I know the reason for the stop, officer?" he asked gently. Instead of answering, the officer asked him to step out of the vehicle. The request came faster than the lieutenant colonel expected. He paused, trying to understand the situation better. He had always believed that clarity helped prevent misunderstandings. So he asked again if there was any specific issue. The officer grew slightly tense. It wasn't anger, but it was clear that he didn't like being questioned. He repeated the instruction, telling him to step out immediately. The lieutenant colonel could feel the pressure building in the air. Though he still could not understand what had gone wrong, he kept his voice steady. "I'm happy to cooperate. I just need to understand what's happening." That single sentence seemed to shift the moment. From the corner of his eye, the lieutenant colonel noticed the second officer step out of the patrol car. Both officers now stood near his vehicle. The second officer rested a hand near his belt, not in a threatening way, but in a way that suggested he was prepared if things escalated. The lieutenant colonel felt a mix of confusion and concern. He was used to stressful situations, but this was different. He was alone in the dark, with officers who clearly believed something serious was going on. He did not want to make the wrong move. The first officer repeated the command once more, this time louder. The lieutenant colonel took a breath and slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He kept his movements visible and calm, hoping it would ease the tension. Before he could fully step out, a passing car slowed down. The driver inside glanced over curiously, noticing the officers surrounding the vehicle. Moments like these always seemed to catch people's attention. As the lieutenant colonel stepped out of the car, the cold air brushed against him. He stood tall, his posture reflecting his years of discipline, though inside he felt uncertain. He placed his hands where they could be clearly seen. The officer asked him to walk to the back of his car. The lieutenant colonel followed the instruction without resisting. Every step echoed softly under the streetlight. He could feel the eyes of the officers watching his every move. One of them asked if the car belonged to him. He confirmed it did. They asked where he was coming from, and he answered honestly. But their expressions didn't change. They seemed fixated on something he still hadn't been told. "What exactly seems to be the problem?" he asked again, trying to keep the conversation respectful. This time, the first officer hesitated. He looked at his partner, then back at the lieutenant colonel. The answer still didn't come, but something in their behavior suggested they believed the car matched the description of a vehicle involved in an earlier incident. They hadn't confirmed it, but their approach showed they wanted to be cautious. The lieutenant colonel felt a wave of frustration, but he kept it inside. He knew reacting emotionally would not help. He needed to stay calm, even though the situation felt unfair. A gentle breeze passed through, carrying the distant sound of another car somewhere far behind them. The moment felt frozen in time. The lieutenant colonel stood waiting, unsure how long this tense pause would last. The officers exchanged glances, whispering something too low for him to hear. He wished they would simply explain what they were looking for. Misunderstandings were dangerous in moments like this. But he also understood that speaking too much or moving too quickly might make things worse. There, in the glow of the streetlight, the tension between caution and confusion grew thicker. The lieutenant colonel kept his back straight, his voice steady, and his patience intact. But deep down, he knew something about this night would change everything that followed. The night felt colder than before as the lieutenant colonel stood near the back of his car. He tried to read the officers' expressions, but their faces revealed very little. Still, he could sense they were unsure. They weren't acting out of anger, but out of caution. And that caution was slowly turning the simple stop into something far more tense. The first officer asked him to keep his hands where they could see them. He nodded and did exactly that. The second officer moved a little to the side, forming a position that allowed him to watch both the lieutenant colonel and the road. It was clear they were following procedure, but the lieutenant colonel still had no idea what triggered this level of alert. Cars passed by from time to time, slowing as curious drivers tried to see what was happening. A few seconds later, someone walking their dog across the street stopped to watch. The lieutenant colonel noticed them out of the corner of his eye. Moments like these always drew attention. Even when no one knew the full story, the first officer spoke again, asking him to state his full name and rank. The lieutenant colonel answered calmly. He had no reason to hide anything. Still, he hoped the mention of his military position would prompt the officers to explain the situation. Instead, they simply wrote down his information. One of the officers walked back to the patrol car to run his information through their system. The lieutenant colonel stayed where he was, hands visible, trying not to let frustration get the best of him. He had been trained to remain composed under pressure, but this was a different kind of pressure. It was personal. The officer checking his information seemed to take longer than usual. The silence stretched on, and the lieutenant colonel felt the seconds moving slowly, almost as if time wanted to remind him how powerless he was at that moment. Finally, the first officer approached again. He looked at the lieutenant colonel carefully, studying him as if trying to piece together a puzzle. "You said you're coming from the base?" the officer asked. "Yes, I am," the lieutenant colonel replied. "I'm heading home." "Is there something specific you're looking for?" The officer exhaled. Not out of annoyance, but because he seemed torn between what he knew and what he still needed to confirm. "Your car matches the description of a vehicle we were told to watch for," he finally said. "We're trying to be cautious until we're sure." It wasn't a full explanation, but it was enough to help the lieutenant colonel understand why the officers were acting the way they were. He nodded slowly. "I understand, but I assure you, I haven't been involved in any incident." The officer didn't respond directly. Instead, he asked a few more questions: where he lived, whether he had driven through a particular area earlier, whether anyone else had used the car recently. The lieutenant colonel answered each question honestly, still hoping the situation would settle soon. As the conversation continued, the second officer remained alert. His eyes moved constantly between the car, the lieutenant colonel, and the surrounding area. It was clear that until they received confirmation from their dispatch, the officers weren't willing to relax. A few minutes later, the radio inside the patrol car crackled. The officer checking the records leaned closer to listen. After a short exchange, he stepped out and walked over. He still looked uncertain. "We need a moment to verify something," he said. "Just stay where you are." The lieutenant colonel nodded again. He was trying to remain patient, but every extra minute made the situation feel heavier. He thought about calling someone from the base to let them know what was happening, but decided against it. Making a call might be misinterpreted, and the officers already seemed tense. The street lamp above them buzzed quietly, casting long shadows across the pavement. The whole scene looked like something people would talk about later, guessing what might have happened. But none of them truly knew the quiet discomfort building inside the lieutenant colonel. He thought of his family waiting for him. They were probably expecting him soon. He wondered whether they would worry if he didn't show up on time. The thought made the night feel even longer. Then, from the side of the road, a young man on a bicycle stopped. He pulled out his phone, holding it up as if thinking about recording. He didn't start filming yet, but the possibility was enough to make the atmosphere feel even more fragile. One wrong moment, one sharp movement, and everything could escalate. The lieutenant colonel felt the weight of that thought. He didn't want to be part of a story that spread online. He didn't want to be misunderstood or placed in a situation where every action would be analyzed by strangers. The first officer noticed the young man with the phone and gave him a quick look. The young man lowered the phone slightly, not wanting to make the officers uncomfortable. But he didn't leave. Finally, after what felt like a long wait, the officer who had checked the system returned with a clearer expression. He still wasn't fully relaxed, but something had shifted. "We're still waiting for confirmation," he said, "but it seems your vehicle may not be the one involved. There are some similarities, but not all the details match." The lieutenant colonel felt a mix of relief and frustration. He wanted the officers to say it clearly that he was not the person they were looking for. But he knew that until they received the final word from dispatch, the tension wouldn't fully disappear. He took a slow breath. "I understand you're doing your job," he said quietly. "I just hope we can clear this up soon." His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't sarcastic. It was simply human, tired, patient, and ready for the situation to end. The officers exchanged another quick look. The night air felt colder now. The lights from the patrol car continued flashing, painting the road in red and blue strokes. Nothing had resolved yet, but something was shifting slowly. Quietly, in the next moments would decide how this tense encounter would unfold. The video of the late night stop began to spread long before anyone expected it. It started with the young man on the bicycle who had paused on the sidewalk. He hadn't intended to cause trouble. He simply felt that something didn't look right. The way the officer stood, the tense air, the uncertainty on the lieutenant colonel's face, it all made him press the record button. He didn't speak during the recording. He just captured the moment, the flashing lights, the silent tension, the way the lieutenant colonel stood calmly with his hands visible. No one knew then that this small act would turn the situation into something much larger. By the time the officers finally received word from dispatch that the car was most likely not the one from the earlier report, the video had already made its way to social media. The young man rode off quietly after filming, uploading the clip when he reached home. He thought a few people might see it, maybe comment on it, and that would be it. But within hours, the video gained attention. People shared it, questioned it, and made their own assumptions. Some wrote that the officers were being too aggressive. Others said they were simply being careful. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The lieutenant colonel's calm behavior stood out. Meanwhile, unaware of how far the clip had reached, the lieutenant colonel simply wanted the night to end. He listened carefully as the first officer finally approached him again. "It looks like this was a mix-up," the officer said. His voice had softened. "Your car isn't a match after all," the lieutenant colonel nodded. He had expected the confusion, but hearing it confirmed brought a quiet sense of relief. Still, a part of him felt heavy. The entire situation could have been avoided with clearer communication. "Thank you for your patience," the second officer added. His posture wasn't as tense anymore. He looked almost apologetic. The lieutenant colonel simply replied, "I understand." He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask for explanations, didn't express anger. He just wanted to go home. The officer stepped back and allowed him to return to his car. He moved slowly, not out of fear, but because the emotional weight of the encounter stayed with him. When he finally sat inside and closed the door, he took a long breath. For the first time since the lights appeared behind him, he felt a moment of peace. When he drove away, he didn't know the video had already been shared thousands of times. He didn't know news pages had begun reposting it. He didn't know people online were debating every second of the footage. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. People paused what they were doing to watch it. Some watched silently, feeling uncomfortable with the tension they saw. Others commented loudly, saying things like, "Why didn't they just explain the reason for the stop?" Or "He handled it better than most people would." On social media, discussions grew rapidly. Hashtags appeared. The clip was reposted by influencers, by veterans, by community groups, and by people who had never met the lieutenant colonel or the officers involved. The story spread not because of drama or anger, but because the moment captured a kind of quiet conflict and misunderstanding that could have gone wrong but didn't. It felt real, raw, and familiar to many people who had experienced tense public encounters. Within hours, local news stations began reporting on it. Reporters reached out to the police department. Some tried to contact the lieutenant colonel, though he had not yet seen the video and didn't realize the attention it had drawn. Neighbors sent him messages asking if he was all right. People from the base whispered about it during morning briefings, wondering if the command would address it. Back on social media, reactions continued pouring in. One person commented he stayed so calm. "I don't know if I could have done that," another wrote. "The officer should have told him the reason from the start. Miscommunication makes everything worse." A few people tried to defend the officers, writing that they were following orders until dispatch confirmed the details. Others focused on how the lieutenant colonel's training kept the situation from escalating. What no one expected was how fast the discussion would reach higher authorities. Late that afternoon, someone from a military community page shared the video, identifying the lieutenant colonel only by rank, not by name. That post was seen by someone at the base. Within an hour, leadership became aware of the situation. The lieutenant colonel was called into a brief meeting not to reprimand him, but to inform him that the video was circulating and gaining traction. He watched the clip quietly, sitting in a small office with two senior officers. Seeing the moment through someone else's camera made him feel even more unsettled. He hadn't wanted attention. He hadn't wanted a public debate. He had only wanted to go home that night. Still, he understood why people reacted the way they did. The video captured more than a police stop. It captured misunderstanding, fear, patience, authority, confusion, and restraint all in one frame. Meanwhile, the police department, phones rang nonstop. Reporters asked questions. Community members demanded clarity. Officers who hadn't been involved watched the clip themselves, forming their own opinions. The two officers from the stop felt the pressure immediately. They weren't suspended, but they were told that the department would issue a statement soon. They felt the weight of the moment, too. What they thought was a routine verification had turned into a controversial discussion. The lieutenant colonel left the base that day with mixed emotions. He knew the situation wasn't finished. He knew people would want answers. He knew the incident would become part of a larger conversation as he drove home, this time in daylight. With no flashing lights behind him, he couldn't shake the thought that something bigger was coming. He didn't know whether to feel worried or hopeful. The video was now beyond anyone's control. It had become a public story, and by the end of that same day, it reached the one place that would shape everything from that moment on, the Pentagon. The news traveled quickly through the halls of the Pentagon, faster than anyone expected. What started as a simple late-night traffic stop had now turned into a national conversation, one that senior officials could not ignore. The video had been shared millions of times, and people across the country were expressing their opinions with strong emotions. Some called it a misunderstanding gone too far, while others said it was a sign that something needed to change. Inside a large office, a group of senior leaders gathered early in the morning. They watched the same video that everyone else had, seen the flashing lights, the tense body language, the calm yet confused expression of the lieutenant colonel. No one spoke for the first few minutes. They simply watched, observing every detail. One of the officials finally broke the silence. "This is going to affect public trust," he said. "And not just trust in law enforcement. This involves one of our own." There was a clear sense of urgency in the room. The Pentagon didn't want to appear distant or passive. The lieutenant colonel had handled himself professionally, and his training had clearly helped prevent the moment from escalating. Still, The fact that a senior military officer had been involved made the situation more delicate. Another official leaned forward. "We need to understand what happened from his perspective," she said. "Before we make any statement, we must hear directly from him." Call was made to the base where the lieutenant colonel served. He was asked to come in for another meeting, this time with higher-ranking officers. When he arrived, he didn't look surprised. After all, once the video went viral, he knew this moment would come eventually. He sat down in a conference room, while a senior officer, calm and respectful, addressed him. "We've seen the footage. We want your full account of what happened." The lieutenant colonel explained everything step by step, the flashing lights, the officer's firm tone, his attempts to ask for clarity, the long wait by the side of the road, and the moment he was finally told it was a mix-up. He didn't exaggerate anything. He didn't blame the officers. He simply described the events as they happened. The senior officer listened closely. There was no interruption, no judgment, only silent concentration. It was clear they wanted the truth, not a polished version. When he finished, the officer nodded. "You handled yourself professionally," he said. "But we need to address the larger situation. This has become a national issue." Back at the Pentagon, discussions continued. Some leaders felt they needed to speak publicly. Others believed that working quietly with the local police department would produce better results. But everyone agreed on one point: transparency and accountability were essential. By the afternoon, representatives from the Pentagon contacted local authorities. They didn't do it to pressure them, but to encourage a fair and clear investigation. They requested all details: the original call, the description of the vehicle, why the officers were so cautious, and what steps would be taken moving forward. Local officials agreed to cooperate. They understood that the situation had grown beyond a simple police stop, and that the public wanted answers. A statement was prepared, promising a thorough review. Meanwhile, the Pentagon prepared its own message. It focused on respect, professionalism, and the importance of clear communication during civilian-military interactions. They emphasized that the lieutenant colonel had demonstrated calm judgment, and they encouraged everyone to wait for the investigation before jumping to conclusions. Reporters kept calling, asking if the lieutenant colonel would speak publicly, but for now, he preferred not to. He didn't want attention. He didn't want to become a symbol. He simply wanted fairness. Inside the Pentagon, discussions shifted to training and improvement. Some officials suggested creating new guidelines for how police departments and military personnel could communicate during traffic stops. Others proposed outreach programs to build better relationships between local law enforcement and nearby bases. The idea wasn't to blame anyone, but to prevent misunderstandings from turning into national controversies. Late that evening, one senior official said, "This isn't just about one night. It's about trust. It's about making sure our service members feel safe and respected when they're off duty." The Pentagon released its statement online shortly after. It didn't take sides. It didn't accuse anyone. Instead, it expressed concern, called for clarity, and assured the public that the matter was being taken seriously. The response was positive. People appreciated the tone. Some felt relieved knowing that leadership had acknowledged the situation without inflaming it further. Back at home, the lieutenant colonel read the statement quietly. He appreciated the support, but he also worried about how long the attention would last. The moment felt bigger than him now. It wasn't just his story anymore. It had become a conversation about communication, trust, and understanding. He sat in his living room, thinking about how quickly life could change. One simple drive home had turned into something he'd never expected. Yet even with the stress, he felt grateful that things hadn't gone worse. He hoped the investigation would bring clarity. He hoped the officers involved would reflect on the situation, and he hoped that everyone watching the video would see it as more than a moment of tension, as a reminder of how careful communication could change everything. As the night came to a close, the lieutenant colonel finally felt a small sense of relief. The situation was still unfolding, but at least now it was moving in a direction that felt honest, respectful, and focused on the truth. And he knew that whatever happened next, the world was watching closely. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of attention, pressure, and hopeful conversation. What had started as a quiet moment on a dark road had now become a national story, and everyone involved understood the importance of how it ended. People were watching not for drama, but for answers, fairness, and clarity at the local police department. The two officers from that night sat in a small conference room as their supervisors reviewed the incident. No one raised their voice. No one accused them of acting with bad intentions. Instead, the discussion focused on communication, procedure, and how easily misunderstandings could lead to unnecessary tension. One of the supervisors spoke calmly. "You followed the report we received," he said, "but the way the interaction was handled could have been better. Clear communication matters. It changes everything." The officers nodded. They understood. After watching the video several times, they saw how their tone and lack of explanation had created uncertainty. They hadn't meant to cause distress. They were simply trying to protect themselves and the public. But now they realized that caution without clarity could look like aggression. The department announced that they would review their traffic stop procedures. They planned to hold additional training sessions focused on communication, especially during high-alert stops. They wanted to make sure future encounters would be safer, calmer, and easier for everyone involved. When the public heard this, many people appreciated the willingness to learn and adapt. Others felt more work needed to be done, but they were encouraged by the direction things were moving. Meanwhile, the lieutenant colonel returned to his routine at the base. His colleagues treated him with respect, but they also tried not to overwhelm him with questions. He appreciated their support. He didn't want sympathy, he just wanted to move forward. One afternoon, he was called into a meeting where senior officers thanked him for maintaining his composure during the stop. They told him that the Pentagon's interaction with local authorities had helped ensure a transparent review, and that his behavior had set an example for how to handle tense situations. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like someone who had done anything remarkable. He simply felt like a person who had tried to stay calm when things became confusing, but he was grateful that the moment had not turned into something worse. Across the country, community leaders, law enforcement groups, and military families began talking about the video in a more meaningful way. People saw it as a reminder that simple misunderstandings could grow if not handled with patience and clear communication. They discussed how both officers and civilians could approach tense moments with more understanding. Some groups organized small community gatherings. They invited police officers, service members, and local residents to talk openly about trust, respect, and safety. For the first time in a long while, people seemed willing to listen to each other instead of arguing. The lieutenant colonel quietly followed these conversations. He was surprised to see how many positive changes were happening because of a moment he never wanted to go viral. He hoped the officers who stopped him were doing all right. He didn't hold anger toward them. He only wished everyone had communicated better that night. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun sink below the trees, he thought about how quickly life could shift. A simple drive home had turned into a national discussion. But maybe he thought this was how change often began, not with big speeches or dramatic events, but with a moment that made people reflect. A few days later, the local police department released the results of their internal review. They confirmed that the stop had been based on an incorrect vehicle description, that no wrongdoing had been found on the lieutenant colonel's part. They also acknowledged that their officers would benefit from clearer communication practices. The statement was honest, direct, and respectful. Many people appreciated it. Shortly after, the Pentagon released a brief update saying they were satisfied with the transparency shown in the review. They highlighted the importance of mutual respect between military personnel and law enforcement. And they reaffirmed their commitment to supporting service members both on and off duty. With both statements released, the public discussion slowly began to calm down. People moved on to other topics, though the video remained a reminder of the importance of patience and communication. As for the lieutenant colonel, he returned to his normal rhythm. He still drove the same route home, still passed the same streetlights, and still enjoyed the quiet air of the evenings. But every now and then, found himself thinking about that night. about how fear and misunderstanding had collided with patience and calm. He didn't see himself as part of a big story. He saw himself as someone who simply wanted clarity. But the world had taken a moment from his life and used it to learn something valuable. In the end, the incident left a lasting impression on everyone who watched the video. Read the statements or join the conversations. It reminded people that calm communication mattered more than quick assumptions. It showed that even tense moments could lead to positive change if handled with honesty and care. And for the lieutenant colonel, it became a quiet chapter in his life one he would always remember. Not for the fear it caused, but for the understanding it helped create.